It's good to see everybody this morning. If you have a Bible, we're going to the book of Genesis. 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis is where we'll spend our times today. In fact, we'll spend all of our time right there. Genesis chapter 22. While you're opening your Bible and getting settled, we welcome all of you. Thank you for being with us today. We have folks visiting with us, as we always do, from our community and from other places around our nation. And whatever brings you to us today, we are very, very grateful for that. We hope you'll have occasion to come be with us again. I want to mention something to you that is extremely important. This weekend, this coming weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we have a special event for our high school and college students. And David Banning, this is Jonathan's dad, that many of you are acquainted with through many of the writings that he's done, particularly for young people, and Jeff Wilson, who preaches in Dallas, or in Houston rather, and grew up really in our congregation. They're going to be together. This is a wonderful program that they've put together about authentic faith. On Friday night, they're going to talk to us about the view of the world that individuals have and the Christian should have. On Saturday, they're going to talk about the Bible, an ancient book, and whether we can trust it in a modern world. And they're going to ask the question, God, are you really there? And how can I know that you are there? And then they'll also be with us next Sunday. So this is for our high school and college students. It begins Friday night. And you all will receive something in the mail about that again this week to remind you of that. That's going to be a wonderful, wonderful weekend, important weekend. And so we hope you'll be thinking about that and making your plans, if you're a high school or college student, to be with us for that very special event. Great to see everybody today. Glad to be home with you. And this morning we're going to continue part of our theme for this year as we talk a little bit about being heaven bound. Before we do that, I just want to say and add my congratulations to Destiny and Dawson and Meredith on their baptisms. We're so proud of our young people, so proud that they've made that decision. These are three wonderful young people, and we're very, very happy for them and happy for their good families and all that brings with it. Great to see all of you this morning. There are two songs that we sing in our churches that in many ways are polar opposites. We sing this song that says, troublesome times are here, filling men's hearts with fear. And then we also sing the song that says, I'm happy today. I'm happy today. In Jesus Christ, I'm happy today. Can you imagine singing those two songs back to back? Because the message of those two really is fairly opposite. There is much, in fact, to be happy about. There is much, in fact, in life, if we're honest, to be troubled about. And so I'm not denigrating either of those. I'm just saying that they often seem to be talking about radically different things. The idea of troublesome times being here, challenges are just a part of everyday life. There's nothing new about that. There's nothing unique about that. Challenges are just part of life. If you're in the military, there are obstacle courses and 1,000 other challenges. If you are in college, there are entrance exams and there are final exams. There are challenges of parents raising their children, and children oftentimes who are trying to decide what to do in the best interest of aging parents. Sometimes it's poor relationship or poor health or poor finances. But challenges come in all shapes and sizes. The most daunting, of course, is the challenge of trusting God when things are difficult in life. And so it's walking with God, trusting God, being with God, praying to God. When you're walking home from the funeral, or you're walking home from a divorce, or you're walking home from a diagnosis, or maybe the rebellion of a child, or the failure of a business, or a hurt that just will not heal. In Genesis 22, Abraham is given the greatest challenge of his life. Now, he's had a lot of challenges up to this point in time, but this, without question, hands down, is the most difficult challenge that he will ever face in life. And we're going to talk about that for just a minute this morning. First, I want to say just a word to you about 2 or 3 myths about challenges that we probably need to get out of the way. And so let's do that first before we get where we're going. Myth number 1, as we get older, things get easier. Well, I think really in many ways that is a myth. Now, I think we tell ourselves that sometimes so that we can keep our sanity. We tell ourselves, when you got little children, if we can just get them past diapers, and then we can get them out of the terrible twos, and if we can get them out of middle school, if we can get them out of the learning to drive years and the dating years, if we can get them out of college, if we can get them on their own where they're responsible for themselves. And so we always think that it's going to be better somehow in the future, and we do that about a variety of things. I have a friend, and he had 3 teenagers at home, and he was talking to one of the members in his church who had 3 toddlers at home. And the man with the 3 toddlers asked my friend with the 3 teenagers, what's the difference in having toddlers and teenagers? And my friend said, well, the difference is this. When your toddlers break something, you throw it away and get another one. When my teenagers break something, it costs me hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And so we're always thinking it's going to be better at some point, surely at some point in the future. Does it get easier when you get older? Ask some of the seniors in this congregation. Ask them if it gets easier to understand electronics and technology. Ask them if it's easier to fill out complicated paperwork and forms. Ask them if it's easier to deal with health that isn't what you want it to be, or energy that wanes, or memories sometimes that fade. Myth number 1, as you get older, everything just gets easier. Myth number 2, as we get older, we have more time. And that's what everybody assumes, don't they? And so people say, you know, when I retire, I'm going to have all kinds of time to do things. But you talk to our retired senior members, and they will tell you all the same thing. Don't know how I ever had time to work, because now they're so busy doing other things that it occupies their time. And myth number 3. Myth number 3, as we get older, the challenges of faith subside. I think we believe that as we get older, the challenges of faith will subside. I saw a commercial this week that Sylvester Stallone is making another Rambo movie. Can you imagine that? I mean, shouldn't Rambo be on a walker in a nursing home by this point in time? Come on. But maybe that movie is designed to say that no matter how old you get, there's still going to be challenges that come your way. I think sometimes we feel like that as we get old, as we get older, Satan will finally just wash his hands of us and figure that he's lost us, so he won't bother us anymore. And God really isn't going to have any important work for us to do when we get old, and so he'll kind of leave us alone, and so we just kind of float and drift along for the rest of our lives. And I tell you that that is a myth. That is a myth as well. I want us to talk a little bit about Abraham today. And I don't really think it's necessary for you to read that long passage in Genesis 22. Most of you are familiar with the story, and if you're not familiar with the story, you'll pick it up, I think, as we go through the story. Abraham's life was one of continual challenges. And so he was challenged first to leave his home. God came to him and he said, I want you to get up out of your home and from your homeland and go to a land that I will show you. Now, there are a couple of important things about that. Number 1, he did that. Hebrews 11 says that by faith, Abraham went to a land that he did not know. And so God didn't give him a GPS. He didn't give him a map. He didn't tell him where he was going to go. He didn't have Zillow to look at good neighborhoods and house prices when he finally would get somewhere. He didn't have any of that. He had no idea where he was going to go, and yet he obeyed God by faith. I've traveled a lot of places, both domestically and abroad. I've been to a lot of places that I would love to go back to, and I've been to some places that I don't care if I ever go back to. And Abraham probably felt the same way about that. But God didn't give him a choice. He just said, I'm going to send you where I want you to go. Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he trusted that God did. And then secondly, in doing that, he lived as a nomad. The text specifically says that he lived in tents. Now, I got to tell you, he came from the Ur of the Chaldees. And excavation and archaeology say that the Ur of the Chaldees was a very sophisticated, modern place in that kind of world. They had nice homes there. They had homes even that had running water at that point in time. There was an awful lot there. It was a land where there was silver and gold that had been discovered. And so Abraham was an extraordinarily wealthy man living an extraordinarily comfortable life. And he will leave his roots, he'll leave his heritage, his home, his family, his life. He's going to be on the move for the rest of his life. Nothing's going to be permanent at all. Nothing will be settled. And he has no promise from God that when he finally gets where God is taking him, that God is going to make things easier for him. None of that at all. Secondly, he was challenged. He was challenged with a child. Well, the child, is always it's an exciting thing in somebody's life. But for Abraham and Sarah, they were way past those childbearing years. And so that's a whole nother sermon for another time about dealing with the faith of that and everything that was involved with that. But the other thing about that is that they're going to raise a child now when they are old. There's a reason why. There's a reason why grandparents, who after they've kept their grandkids, small toddler grandkids, for 2 or 3 days, always say, you know what, there's a reason why God had young people have kids. But Abraham and Sarah, they didn't have an option about that. They are extraordinarily old, and yet they're going to have to raise a child. And then they're going to be challenged, Abraham's going to be challenged with sacrificing that challenge. or sacrificing that child. Now, without any question, this is the most difficult challenge that Abraham will face. He's about 120 years old. He's about 120 years old, and God comes to him, and the first 12 words of Genesis 22 are, "It came to pass that after these things, God tested Abraham." But this was going to be a test unlike any other test that Abraham has ever had. It is a test. There are a lot of things that are tested. Products are tested before they are put on the market. Drugs are tested before they are sold for public use. Students are tested before they are given credit for a class. And God's children are often tested to prove what they are made of. But this is going to be a test like no other. And so God comes to Abraham and he says, "I want you to take your son." And then he says, "By the way, this is your only son." And then he says, "This is your only son whom you love. Unless you should think that maybe somehow you can substitute Ishmael," he says, "even Isaac." And so God says, "I want you to take your son, your only son, the son you love, even Isaac." And so he's very, very clear about all of that. There's a little side point here that I think is interesting. This is the first time that the word love is used in our Bibles, in the arrangement, the order of our English Bibles. And that's interesting because in the context of taking your son that you love, it's making him a sacrifice. The first time that the word love is used in the New Testament is in Matthew 3:17, when God says, "This is my beloved son." Love is a constituent part of that word beloved, and that has to do with Christ and Isaac, who is a type of Christ. And it's almost as if God says from the beginning, look, love is always going to involve sacrifice. Love will always involve sacrifice. And so he teaches that in the first use of the word all the way back in Genesis chapter 22. And the text says, if you're familiar with the story, that Abraham arose early in the morning, and he's going to get about doing what God told him to do. "I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, the son that you love, and I want you to offer him." And he has to offer him as a burnt offering. And he rose early in the morning. Obedience was his first response. You know, this is not a hypothetical, right? This is not, I've seen commercials for a program that I've never seen. There's a program on ABC that's called "What Would You Do?" And I know that they set up all these hypothetical situations where they plant money or that people find, or wallets that people find, or things like that. And the question is, what would you do? Well, this isn't a hypothetical like that. This isn't just talking about this. See, we can do that, don't we? We discuss in our Bible classes, if God came to you and said, "I want you to sacrifice your son," what would we do about that? And we talk about that. We banter that around. And sometimes at the Lord's Supper, we'll give a Lord's Supper talk, and we'll talk about God asking Abraham to give his son Isaac, and that's a shadow of God giving his son. And could we do that? And what would we do with all that? But I want to tell you, when we have discussed all of that, for us, it's just talk. That's all it is. It's just talk. Nobody's ever asked us to do that. And so we can talk about it easily. We can decide what we could do about that, when in reality, we don't know what we would do, because that's not the situation that we're in. But it was for Abraham. And he didn't have to think about it. He didn't say to God, "I'll get back to you later." He didn't try to negotiate with God like he did for the city of Sodom. He didn't parse God's words looking for a loophole. And he didn't say, "I'm going to have to go talk to a friend of mine and get some advice and counsel about what I ought to do about this that God's asked me to do." He just obeyed. And to his credit, Abraham had decided that the only way that any of this could happen, he had decided the only way this could happen was that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. That he was going to sacrifice him, and then God would raise him from the dead. And I got to tell you, that was a pretty big leap of faith. You and I look at that and we say, well, there are a lot of instances in the Bible where people were raised from the dead, but not yet. Not by Genesis 22, there are not. And yet, his faith in God is so strong that he believes that if God's going to fulfill the promise, and that certainly he would, that he would raise him from the dead. But it still had to be tough because God didn't stop him on day one of his journey, and God didn't stop him on day two of his journey. And God didn't stop him when he walked away from the servants, and God didn't stop him when he built the altar, and God did not stop him when Isaac asked, Dad, we have everything here except the sacrifice. Where's the sacrifice? He didn't stop him until the knife was in the air about to be plunged into his boy. I wonder how many of us would have chosen disobedience. Because I got to tell you, disobedience is easy. Disobedience is painless, it's comfortable, it seems reasonable. Disobedience is easy when you look and you say, look, I know what God said, but that really doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, how many times do we reason like that? Yeah, I know what God said about that, but this isn't convenient. Or this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't seem right. See, disobedience is easy because sometimes we don't feel like obeying. We don't feel like being kind. We don't feel like being hospitable. We don't feel like forgiving. We don't feel like being honest. We don't feel like being Christ-like. We don't feel like being responsible. In other words, we don't feel like doing the right thing or being the right person. And so, we often choose disobedience. But what I want us to focus on in the few minutes that we have left is the nature of the challenge that Abraham faced. Because this challenge was unlike anything else that Abraham had faced in his life. Now, he had challenges from day one, from the day that God called him. From the day God called him, he faced one challenge after another, but nothing like this. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him a burnt offering to me. If you're taking notes on your family report, I'm going to tell you 3 things about that I think are applicable to our lives today. Let me give them to you quickly, and the lesson's yours. Here they are. Number 1, your greatest challenge may still be ahead of you. You've got to know that at this point in life, Abraham thinks as he's kind of sailing along, that all those great challenges that he'd overcome, particularly leaving his home, leaving his family, leaving everything that was comfortable, and doing what God said about being a nomad, going to a land where he had no idea where he's going. Abraham's got to be thinking, my challenges are all in the past. And what this teaches us is that your greatest challenge may still be ahead of you. It may be personal, it may be emotional, but it may challenge everything that you know and believe. You know, I think all of us, when you get some age on you, we all begin to think that we've reached probably a point in life where the worst is surely over. For Abraham, he had left Ur. He had left home. He left everything that he was comfortable with. And you have to know that he thought, man, my greatest challenges are in the past. Things are going along well. I got my boy. I got the promise. Everything is fine. But it wasn't that way. And it may not be for you or me either. It may be a serious accident. It may be a debilitating illness. It may be a broken relationship. It may be, and you fill in the blank there. It's easy to think that you'll never face anything as tough as what you've already been through. Abraham's 120 years old. He's got to believe that the great challenges of his life are done and over with. But he teaches us otherwise. But he also teaches us that what we do today prepares us for the challenges of tomorrow. Do you remember in the mountain message that Jesus said, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man that built his house on a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it didn't fall because it was founded on the rock. You know what we learn from the life of Abraham and from this little statement of Jesus in the mountain message is that every day you build a little bit of a foundation of faith. That every day, with the little challenges that you overcome, every day, you're building a foundation so that when the great challenge comes, you don't collapse. Because the fact of the matter is that storms will come, winds will blow, rain will fall into every life, and floods will rise. It's inevitable in every life, every single life. And what you do day by day by day before that, it gets you ready for that. In fact, let's just talk about that. Secondly, your greatest challenge is met by success with lesser challenges. And you see that in the life of Abraham, that he's going to go and sacrifice his boy. He does what God asks him to do. He gets up immediately the next morning. They do travel. He leaves the servants behind because he knows that the servants, when he starts trying to tie up his son, his servants will stop him. His servants will think that he has lost his mind, and they will stop him. So he leaves them behind. And he's going to do what God asked him to do. But don't miss this. God didn't start with Abraham with the sacrifice of Isaac. He didn't start there with Abraham. He started him with leaving his homeland in Ur, and then leaving his family in Haran, and then leaving Lot, his nephew. And what did Abraham learn from those earlier challenges that he successfully navigated? Well, he learned that God was good, and that God was there, and that God was true to his word. And the same is true for us, because before we get to our greatest challenge, there'll be some lesser challenges. And they're the ones that really do prepare us for when the really great challenge comes our way. You know, it may be something like having to leave an area you love to get a job that you need. It may be that you'll have to leave a church that you've grown up with and that you love in order to go somewhere else in this country. It could be 1,000 other smaller challenges. But the point is that each one of those smaller challenges gets you ready for when the great challenge comes. And so third and finally, your greatest challenge will require your greatest help. Your greatest challenge will require your greatest help. Now, Abraham learned 3 things about his faith. When you read this story, he learned about himself that he was completely willing to surrender to the will of God. And he learned that he could completely obey God regardless of whether it was something that he wanted to do or not, whether he felt like doing it, because I will guarantee you he didn't feel like sacrificing his boy. And third, he learned that he can completely trust God to fulfill his word. Now, I want you to listen very carefully. That didn't come on day one of his introduction to God. That didn't come on the first day that he was introduced to Yahweh, when he had grown up in a pagan family, in a pagan society. And so he didn't learn those 3 things on the first day that he was introduced to God. He learned those 3 things day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year as he did the right thing. And so in Genesis 22, God says to him, now I know that you would withhold nothing from me. But I tell you what, God wasn't the only one who knew that day. Abraham knew. Our adversary, the devil, knew. Isaac knew. Abraham's servants knew. Sarah would know when she learned about this. And I think sometimes what we say about that is, well, but you know what, Don? If God spoke to me, if God spoke to me like he did to Abraham, then I would obey him without any questions too. But, I mean, hasn't God spoken to us with equal clarity in his word? I mean, God says things clearly in his word. You'd have to work to misunderstand, just as clearly as he spoke to Abraham. God says, don't ever lie. God says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. God says, forgive your offenders. God says, love your enemies. God says, encourage rather than discourage. God says, leave judging to him. God says, give rather than hoard. You say, how can I do any of that? Look at Philippians 4 and 13. I can do all things through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. That verse doesn't have anything to do, as it often does during a football season or a basketball season, when an athlete has scored the winning touchdown and made the winning basket, and they're interviewed immediately afterwards, and they say, I just want to give glory to God because I can do all things through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. I like the sentiment, but the application is wrong. This is talking about who we are fundamentally, and whether or not we're going to live what we say we believe. And Paul says, I can go on. Somebody says, well, I can't go on. Paul says, yes, you can. I can't forgive. Paul says, yes, you can. I can't face those people. Paul says, yes, you can. I can't survive this loss. And Paul says, yes, you can. Paul says, you say, I can't endure another problem. And Paul says, yes, you can. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We want to get even. God says, forgive. We want to be served. God says, no, serve. We want to accumulate. God says, I want you to give. We want to serve later. God says, serve now. We want to judge. God says, understand. We want to blame others. God says, take responsibility. We want green pastures, and God says, sometimes there's going to be some dark valleys, and the table's going to be in front of your enemy. How do you do that? Well, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But let's be really, really clear about this, and this is what I want you to get before we end this morning, please. Let's be really clear about that. If you don't have a daily relationship with God, if you have no daily relationship with Jesus Christ, you're not going to have His strength when the crisis comes. I mean, if you're not praying on a daily basis, that's not a part of your life. If you don't have any relationship with God on a day-by-day basis, then don't expect Him to come to your rescue when you're in a crisis. Your daily walk will determine the outcome of your greatest trial. Your daily walk will determine the outcome of your greatest challenge. Your daily walk will determine the outcome of your greatest test. Why? Listen to me. Because your greatest challenges and tests in life do not develop your character. Your greatest test and challenge of life reveal your character. They reveal who you are. And they reveal whether or not you're walking with God on a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month, year-by-year basis. The question that is always asked from Genesis 22 in this story of Abraham and God telling him to sacrifice his son, the question that is always asked is, how could God ask Abraham to do that? How could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? And the answer to that is because God was willing to do it Himself. I want you to look at the screen one more time this morning before we stop. The details of Genesis 22 are given with the specificity with which they are because they relate to other parts of the Bible. And so it is specified in Genesis 22 that the mountain that Abraham approached and whereby he would sacrifice his son was the Mount Moriah. And we're told, for example, in 2 Chronicles 3 and beginning in verse 1, that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And there's no accident that those things are specified as they are. Because, ladies and gentlemen, it was here. It was at this place where Abraham would offer his son Isaac that years later another sacrifice would be made without the hand of the Father being restrained. Abraham and Jesus have so much in common. Isaac and Jesus have so much in common. Isaac and Jesus were both children of promise. Isaac and Jesus both carried the instrument of sacrifice, the wood upon which they would be sacrificed, to Mount Moriah. Isaac and Jesus would both die. Jesus literally. Hebrews 11 says that Isaac died figuratively, in a sense, that he was already dead in his dad's mind. And Isaac and Jesus both rose from the dead. Jesus literally, Isaac figuratively again, as Hebrews 11 says, Abraham, in essence, received him back to life. So somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem was Mount Moriah, and somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem was Calvary. But the difference is that the hand of the Father was not stayed when it was Calvary. And so if the question is, as you read that story, how could God possibly ask Abraham to do that? It's because he was willing to do it himself. And that is precisely what he did for us. It's precisely why we need to walk with him day by day and week by week and month by month. And it is precisely the reason that if we'll do that, then we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. But it begins by being his child. And if you're not his child today, you can be his child through the water of baptism. And if that's you, this invitation's for you. Let's stand and let's sing.